the authorities have told us we should eat less saturated fat, more carbohydrate, and this has been terrible advice, which has at the very best coincided with this epidemic of diabetes and obesity, and at worst has been causative rather than associative.
The sugar industry is a massive money-making machine. The decision makers of our policies and the general public don't read through the scientific literature and will therefore act in accordance with the USDA recommendations.
It seems that the government and our health authorities had really gotten it completely wrong on saturated fat, the reason we avoid meat and cheese and whole milk. Our current dietary recommendations, these are them. Most of you probably grew up on the food pyramid that we've all lived off of, recommending that the bulk of our calories really come from grains, mainly carbohydrates. No red meat, no butter, barely any cheese.
How much cheese is too much cheese? Any amount of cheese.
Every school child gets this, everybody learns it, every doctor, nutritionist, every dietitian. That took me into the world of dietary fat.
A world you'd like to believe was both simple and harmless, but this was not the case. You see, the Sugar Research Foundation ended up paying off scientists to cover up the deleterious health outcomes of sugar consumption. This only came to light though in 2016, when the truth finally came out in a paper from the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine titled Sugar Industry and Coronary Heart Disease Research, a history analysis of internal industry documents. Yet most people still aren't aware of this truth.
I discovered all sorts of things that really as a journalist made my ears perk up, like calling up scientists saying, I can't talk to you about fat, and hanging up on me. Scientists telling me they had been visited by officials from the margarine industry and told to yank papers from journals.
It's not mine, it's a library book.
Sometimes I would hang up the phone after these phone calls and sort of be shaking like, am I investigating the mob or am I investigating nutrition science? What is going on?
During the 50s, the cause of heart disease was very much in the forefront of scientific debate. And by the 1960s, two opposing hypotheses were produced by two very different scientists. One being John Yudkin, a British physiologist who strongly believed sugar was the main cause. The other being American physiologist Ancel Keys, who pointed the finger towards saturated fat as the main culprit. One of these theories was correct, while the other would go on to become the most influential hypothesis in the history of nutrition science.
How do we come to believe what we believe about saturated fat and cholesterol?
Stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
So what happened in 1980, where we can see that adult obesity rates skyrocket upwards? Adults in their prime are dying left, right and centre, yet this hadn't happened to their parents. So what's going on? Well, it all starts in the 50s.
This man, Ancel Keys, is a pathologist at the University of Minnesota. He came up with his diet-heart hypothesis, and his idea was that you would eat saturated fat and cholesterol in your diet, and this would lead to your having elevated cholesterol in your blood. This would clog your arteries and would give you a heart attack. That was his hypothesis.
It was cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels.
He drew a graph, 6 countries, the amounts of fats in calorie terms and the numbers of heart disease deaths in those countries, and he drew the most perfect graph you can get. It was a superb line.
And as you can see, there's a real nice curve to it.
There's a flaw. At the time that Keys did this in 1953, there were data from 22 countries he could have used. He didn't use the 16 that didn't agree. And when you add those to his graph, there is no relationship at all. Countries with much higher levels of heart disease eating less fat, and vice versa.
It was pure manipulating, or we could call it fraud. This is pure fraud.
He could argue anyone to the death, fiercely a believer in his hypothesis.
The facts are simple.
So in the JAMA paper, we can see that the Sugar Research Foundation had interest in promoting a low-fat diet to prevent coronary heart disease. And you can see it states clearly, leading nutritionists are pointing out the chemical connection between America's high-fat diet and the formation of cholesterol. If the carbohydrate industries were to recapture this 20% of the calories in the US diet, and if sugar maintained its present share of the carbohydrate market, this change would mean an increase in the per capita consumption of sugar more than a third.
They paid $5.3 million to educate policymakers, which are basically politicians with no scientific background, on how fat causes heart disease by basically saying, hey, look inside this artery, it's got fat in it. Look in this food, there's fat. There's no sugar inside this artery. Sugar can't go inside the artery, fat goes in the artery, therefore fat is evil, sugar's good. Makes sense to me. I have no idea about science. And with a $5.3 million investment into the propaganda, they managed to get the policy to stimulate the business associated with the profit of selling sugar by taking 20% of the allocated calories in the food pyramid off the fat to give to sugar.
Now look at this convenient correlation that happens when we decrease our saturated fat and cholesterol intake and increase our overall carbohydrate consumption.
We on? We live? Now there's two very bad blokes that haven't yet been mentioned in this story.
One being Frederick Stair, who was on the scientific advisory board at the SRF at the time, and the other being nutritionist David Mark Hegsted. Now these men were both bribed by the Sugar Research Foundation using a persuasive $6,500 each, which is equivalent of $50,000 of today's money, to basically counter John Yudkin's studies and the Iowa Group's research, which showed strong links between the consumption of sugar and coronary heart disease. Their so-called findings were printed in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, the literature stating that the best way to prevent heart disease is to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats.
Cut out animal foods. Instead of butter, which is saturated, you have margarine, which comes from polyunsaturated vegetable oils. I think it's harder to imagine how you have vegetable oils instead of meat for dinner, but that was the idea. The Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association, really the only public health group that was dealing with heart disease, and everybody was following their advice. Ansel Keys gets on the Nutrition Committee, and 1 year later, with no greater data in hand, he's able to get this recommendation published, which says you need to restrict your saturated fat and cholesterol in order to prevent heart disease. And this is the first advice anywhere in the world telling people to cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol. Ansel Keys really won the day. There was a demand for some kind of answer. He walked into this vacuum with a very strong idea, and his idea became adopted by the American Heart Association, and he still is the most influential nutrition scientist in the history of nutrition science.
If only a small fraction of what we know about the effects of sugar were to be revealed in relation to any other material used as a food additive, that material would promptly be banned.
Governments around the world for billions of dollars in randomized controlled clinical trials. And what were the results? There has no effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. They did not show him to be correct.
The facts are simple.
I don't normally quote epidemiological studies, but I do, and they have contrary results. The largest ever epidemiological study that's been done globally, they found that the more saturated fat people ate, the lower their risk of stroke. I think we got it wrong on saturated fats.
If you look in any biochemistry textbook, you will find a diagram that shows the molecule cholesterol. It'll say, here is a molecule of cholesterol, carbons, hydrogens, all that kind of stuff. There isn't one called HDL cholesterol. There isn't one called LDL cholesterol. There's only one form. It is cholesterol. The HDL and LDL part are not cholesterol at all. They are lipoproteins, the delivery agent, a package to package up fats and to travel them around in your blood. Otherwise, they would just separate out of your blood. And that's what lipoproteins do. Your doctor is absolutely mandated to tell you that if your LDL is above this level X, then you are to be prescribed a statin, and your doctor is to lean on you as hard as possible to get you to comply.
That may have to do with the fact that statins are billion-dollar drugs.
Unfortunately, the whole argument falls to bits as soon as you start to look at it scientifically. Atherosclerosis, which causes heart disease, is caused by chronic systemic inflammation. Of that, there is no doubt whatsoever. It is not the concentration of circulating cholesterol in your blood. So anyone that says cholesterol, and in particular, somehow the cholesterol carried by low-density lipoprotein is causal in heart disease, well, I say, fine, show me the experiment that backs that up. There isn't one, ergo, forget it. It's ridiculous.
People who lowered their intake of saturated fats and cholesterol died at much higher rates of cancer. So people who choose to substitute animal fats for things like vegetable seed oils and plant butters, soy milk and soy-filled burgers, clearly appear to be at much higher risk at death from cancer.
One day there are going to be snow tires made of soy. It is so versatile.
Yeah, good one.
You look at the largest associative data set that's in existence anywhere in the world. So the British Heart Foundation have measured the total and LDL cholesterol and averaged it out for people in 168 different countries, several 100 million data points around the world. What we get is a graph that shows us that the lower your cholesterol, total cholesterol that is, the lower that is below 220, the more that associates with death from all causes and from every sub-cause as well. So you name it, all the big killers, every single one of them all follow the same trend.
Our hearts and our brains absolutely need animal nutrition to thrive. A particular omega-3 fatty acid known as docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, comprises up to 20% of the human brain and can be found solely within the fats of animal products. Another essential fatty acid called eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA, is also required to be taken in conjunction with DHA through food intake.
What were the original fats that people cooked with? Tallow and suet, lard and butter. And oils used to fuel the Industrial Revolution. In the early 1900s, somebody looked at cottonseed oil and figured out a way to harden it and said, that looks a lot like lard. Why don't we try to sell that to Americans to eat? And that was Crisco. And after that came regular vegetable oils.
And this crap's still being pushed and people are still eating it today.
The U.S. Dietary Guidelines in 2015, they have dropped any low-fat language. The reason was it doesn't lower your risk of heart disease, and in fact may worsen it. Why is this not more widely known? The National Institutes of Health, the American Heart Association, and then the U.S. government was on board. They really controlled the nutrition agenda. The Minnesota Coronary Survey was the largest ever test on Ansel Keys' hypothesis. It took place in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals, so well controlled. They controlled the diet. It was on more than 9,000 men and women, one of the few studies to include women. Half the people were put on a diet that was considered average in saturated fats at the time, regular milk, regular meat, cheese. The other half were put on 9% saturated fat, which is about what we're recommended to eat now. So soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese. At the end of 4.5 years of that experiment, this was their conclusion. There was no difference in the treatment and the control groups.
You just can't make this crap up. If there's any naysayers watching right now and you're thinking, this is a conspiracy theory, in the show notes below, I have linked the original JAMA paper from 2016 exposing all of this stuff, so give it a read.
Subsequently, some researchers from NIH went back and looked at the original tapes that were in the basement from this study, the original magnetic tapes, and reanalyzed them and found out that actually, the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the greater their risk of dying from heart disease. And that had never been published in this original paper. These original findings were not published for 16 years. And then they're put in this out-of-the-way paper that they know nutritionists will not read. And this is pictured here as Ivan France, who is one of the project investigators. And when he was asked, much later by a journalist, well, how come you didn't publish the results? He said, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. In the late 1970s, Senator George McGovern had a select Senate committee on nutrition, and they were mainly looking at undernutrition, but they decided to look at these new killer diseases coming up, heart disease, and now cancer was on the rise. That committee published this report. It was written by one Senate staffer with no background in nutrition who was sort of on his way to becoming a vegetarian and very much influenced by the American Heart Association. So they published this report, and that is what becomes our dietary guidelines, is what happened in 1980.
Though the low-fat diet is no longer recommended so strongly, it is, however, still pushed on us by the same forces that have damaged human health. The vast majority of people still avoid saturated fats and cholesterol due to the fact that we're encouraged to move towards plant-based diets. The promotion of high-carb, low-fat diets are funded by corporate interests, a world of nutrition that is controlled by greed and power. As long as we remain ignorant enough of true nutrition science, the top 10 sugar companies will continue to make trillions at the expense of our health.
Look how powerful the guidelines are. They are downloaded virtually by all the medical association, nutritionists, and the Diabetes Association, school lunch programs, feeding programs for the elderly, women and infant children, what's fed to them. Those are the biggest budget line in USDA budget. Every point of contact with patients in every office, in every setting, you're being taught the guidelines. So what about the vegetarian diet? They could find no randomized controlled clinical trials to support the health benefits of that diet. They had to give it the lowest rank that they could possibly give for available data. They couldn't find any evidence for it, but they recommended it anyway. Why are we all following them? Currently, our dietary guidelines are only for healthy Americans. Did you know that?
There are a few words that I don't allow, and healthy is one of them.
And this lady is an influencer.
So that applies to less than 20% of America is still considered metabolically healthy.
Now known as the Sugar Association, the SRF still denies links between cardiovascular disease and the consumption of sugar. They continue to promote carbohydrates as the bulk of the human diet, despite its contribution to literally every chronic disease in the book. The USDA has done very little to fix the damage that continues to ripple outward and devastate all of our lives.
What's great about soy? It's not dairy, it's not meat. That means there's no cholesterol in it, very little saturated fat in it. It's healthy overall, but there's more to it than that.
I think the main take-home message here is that it's down to us as individuals. We need to take responsibility for our own health outcomes, starting by discarding the guidelines and the misanthropic dietary advice that is still upon us. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to share with anyone who's interested in food, someone that you know is a carbohydrate addict. Please share, please like, please subscribe. That would be fantastic. It just helps me out, helps boost the channel, as you all know. And let's get this message out to a larger audience that definitely deserves to know about these truths. So thanks guys, take care.